She was just trying to get home. Emma had worked a 12-hour shift at the hospital. It was past midnight. The snowstorm had turned her quiet street into something she barely recognized. White, silent, completely empty. She turned into her driveway and almost killed a man. Her headlights caught him at the last second. A large, dark shape collapsed in the snow directly in front of her car. She slammed the brakes. The car slid, stopped 3 inches from his body. She got out. She ran to him, and when she turned him over, the snow beneath him was completely red. He was alive. Barely. She had 2 choices: leave him in the snow and call 911, or drag him inside. She chose wrong. Or maybe she chose exactly right. She just had no idea what she had brought through her front door. Before we start, where in the world are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And if you love stories about chubby girls who change the most powerful men alive, subscribe. Now let's get into it. Emma Calloway had a rule about getting involved in things that were not her business. It was a good rule, a sensible rule. It had kept her life small and quiet and entirely manageable for 31 years, and she was proud of it. She was a plus-size, curvy woman who wore her scrubs like armor and her kindness like a second skin. And after 12 hours on her feet in the trauma bay at Mercy General, she had exactly enough energy left to drive home, eat whatever was in her refrigerator, and fall asleep with her shoes still on. The snowstorm that had been threatening all week had finally arrived while she was working, burying the city under 2 feet of white silence. The roads home were empty. The streetlights made the falling snow look almost beautiful. Emma drove carefully, both hands on the wheel, thinking about absolutely nothing. That was the last ordinary moment of her life. She turned into her driveway on autopilot, the way you do after 1,000 nights of the same route home. Her headlights swept across the familiar narrow strip of concrete and caught something that did not belong there. A shape, dark and large and completely wrong. Her foot hit the brake before her brain had fully processed what she was seeing. The car slid on the packed snow 3 inches, maybe 4, and stopped. She sat completely still for 1 second, both hands locked on the wheel, heart slamming against her ribs. Then she got out into the cold and ran. He was face down in the snow, a large man, broad-shouldered, heavy, wearing a dark jacket that had no business being worn in a blizzard. Emma dropped to her knees beside him, the cold soaking instantly through her scrub bottoms, and pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck. A pulse, weak and unsteady, but there. She rolled him carefully onto his back, and the snow beneath him, what had looked dark from a distance, was red, deeply, unmistakably red. He had been bleeding long enough to melt through the top layer of snow entirely. Her training took over so completely and so fast that the fear did not have time to arrive until much later. She could not leave him there. She knew that before she had even finished the thought. She was a trauma nurse. She had taken an oath. She had also, in the 12 years since she qualified, never once been able to walk past a person who needed help, not in the hospital, not on the street, not even when every sensible part of her brain was screaming that this particular person, this enormous unconscious bleeding stranger in her driveway in the middle of a blizzard, was a very specific kind of trouble she was not equipped for. She grabbed him by the jacket with both hands, dug her heels into the snow, and pulled. He did not move. She pulled again. He moved an inch. She kept going. It took her 11 minutes to get him through the front door. She knew because she counted something she did in the trauma bay when the work was brutal, and she needed her mind to stay mechanical rather than emotional. 11 minutes of dragging 200+ pounds of dead weight up 3 porch steps and across the threshold, her thick arms burning, her breath coming in white clouds in the freezing air. When she finally got him onto the living room rug and slammed the door against the storm, she stood bent over her own knees for a full 30 seconds, just breathing. Then she opened her trauma bag and got to work. She cut away his jacket and shirt with her medical shears and stopped. His torso was not what she expected. It was covered in old scars, the kind that did not come from accidents, and tattoos that ran from his collarbone down both arms in dense, deliberate black work. She was not a woman who frightened easily. But something about the specific pattern of those marks, the combination of old damage and deliberate ink, made something quiet and cold settle in her chest. She kept working. She packed the wound, controlled the bleeding, checked his airway, covered him with every blanket she owned, and aimed the space heater directly at him. And then, when there was nothing left to do with her hands, she noticed something she had been too focused to register earlier. The hard rectangular shape pressing through what remained of his waistband. A gun. She took it to the kitchen counter with 2 fingers, set it down, and stood looking at it for a long moment. She went back to him. She sat on the edge of the coffee table, her knees pulled to her chest, and looked at the unconscious man on her living room floor. His color was still bad. His breathing was shallow. He needed a hospital. He had a gun. She had no idea who he was or what had happened to him or who had done it, and he could not tell her because he was not awake to tell her anything at all. She had made her choice the moment she ran to him in the driveway. She understood that now. There was no unchoosing it. It was only when she finally stood up to wash his blood off her hands that she looked out the kitchen window and saw it, the long dark stain in the snow of her driveway. Already half covered by the falling blizzard, but still visible, still readable, a trail that started somewhere out on the road and ended at her front door. Whoever had done this to him would not need an address. They just had to follow the blood. He woke at 2:40 in the morning. Emma knew the exact time because she had been watching the clock on the microwave from the armchair across the room, counting the minutes between his breathing checks the way she did with critical patients in the ICU, not because the clock meant anything, but because counting was the only thing keeping her mind from running somewhere she could not afford to go. She had almost fallen asleep, twice. The third time her eyes closed, she heard it, a sharp intake of breath, the heavy shift of a large body on the floor, and then a silence so loaded it woke her faster than any alarm. She was on her feet before she was fully conscious. He was already trying to sit up. His hand found her wrist before she could step back. Not a grab, not the desperate reflex of a frightened man. It was deliberate, controlled. The grip of someone who, even half-conscious and bleeding and running a fever that should have had him flat on his back for another 12 hours, still moved like a person who was used to being the most dangerous thing in any room. Emma did not pull away. She had learned early in her career that pulling away from a confused patient in crisis was the fastest way to make a bad situation catastrophic. She looked at him directly and said, in the same calm, steady voice she used in the trauma bay when everything was going wrong, and she needed to be the one thing that was not. "You have 2 broken ribs, a through and through on your left side, and a fever of 103. I have spent the last 2 hours keeping you alive. Let go of my wrist, or you will tear every stitch I just put in." A long silence. His grip loosened. He did not apologize, but his eyes changed, something shifting behind them, brief and quickly controlled, and he watched her differently after that. He would not tell her his name. She asked once, cleanly, "The way you ask a question you already suspect will not be answered." He looked at her with those dark gray eyes and said nothing at all. So she stopped asking. She called him nothing, spoke to him in the direct, practical language she used with all her patients, and went about the business of keeping him alive with the same focused competence she brought to every shift. She checked his temperature every hour. She changed the dressing on his wound with hands so steady that she caught him watching them, not her face, just her hands, with an expression she could not entirely read. The snowstorm outside had gotten worse. The windows were completely white. The whole world had reduced itself to this small, warm house, and the 2 of them inside it, and the howling dark beyond the glass. And there was something about that, the absolute enforced smallness of it, that made the silence between them feel less like distance and more like something else entirely. Around 4 in the morning, the fever spiked. He began to drift in and out, not fully unconscious, but not fully present either, caught somewhere in the hot, restless space between. He muttered things. She was not trying to listen, but the house was quiet, and she was right beside him, and she heard every word. A name said once, with a specific weight that told her it was not a name he said often. Then something that sounded like coordinates. Then clearer than anything else, in a voice so flat and certain it made her chest tighten. "He knew where I would be. Nobody else knew." She pressed a cool cloth to his forehead and said nothing. But she understood what she had just heard. Whoever had put a bullet in this man and left him in the snow to die was not a stranger. It was someone he had trusted completely. And in her experience, both professional and personal, that particular kind of wound took a great deal longer to heal than the one in his side. She made soup at 5 in the morning because she needed something to do with her hands, and because hot food was the most human comfort she knew how to offer. She brought it to him without asking if he wanted it, set the bowl on the floor beside him, and went back to her chair. He looked at the bowl for a long time, long enough that she thought he was going to refuse it. Long enough that she started to feel faintly self-conscious about the gesture, and then he picked it up with both hands and drank from it slowly, without using the spoon she had placed beside it. He did not thank her, but when he set the empty bowl down, he looked at her across the dim room and held her gaze for a moment that lasted slightly longer than necessary. She looked away first. She was not entirely sure why. His fever broke just before 7. She knew because the quality of his sleep changed, the restless muttering stopped, the rigid tension in his jaw and shoulders finally released, and his breathing deepened into something that sounded genuinely like rest for the first time all night. Emma sat beside him in the low lamplight, her own exhaustion sitting on her like a physical weight. She had been awake for over 20 hours. She should have moved to the armchair. She should have put more distance between herself and the unconscious, dangerous stranger on her living room floor. Instead, she stayed where she was, close enough to monitor him, and watched his face in the quiet. Without the fever and the tension and the cold gray watchfulness, it was a different face, still sharp, still marked by things she would never know, but quieter, almost, in the warm low light, something close to peaceful. She reached out slowly, the way you move when you are trying not to disturb something, and brushed the hair back from his forehead, just once, just gently. Her hand rested against his temple for one moment, and then she leaned forward without thinking about it at all and pressed her lips softly to his forehead, a nurse's instinct, a woman's feeling, both at once. She started to pull back. His hand came up and wrapped around her wrist, slow and deliberate, and completely awake. She froze. His eyes were open, had been open, she realized with a drop in her stomach, for longer than she wanted to calculate. He had been pretending to sleep. He looked up at her in the lamplight and said absolutely nothing. She said absolutely nothing. The storm outside pressed against the windows, and the lamp threw its warm circle across the two of them, and neither of them moved for a very long time. When she finally pulled her wrist free, she stood up and walked to her bedroom without a single word, and closed the door quietly behind her. She lay in the dark for a long time, staring at the ceiling, her wrist still warm where his hand had been. Downstairs, the house was completely silent. And then, faint, controlled, in a language she did not recognize, she heard his voice. One short phone call, 3 sentences, and then nothing. She did not know what he had said or who he had said it to, but she knew, with the particular certainty of a woman who had spent her entire career reading the things people could not say out loud, that by morning absolutely nothing about her life was going to look the same. She heard them before she saw them. Emma had been awake since 6, sitting at her kitchen table with a coffee she had not touched, staring at the wall and thinking about nothing and everything at the same time, the way you do when your brain is too full to pick a direction. The storm had quieted overnight. The snow had stopped falling somewhere around 5 in the morning and left behind a deep, absolute stillness, the specific silence of a world that has been completely buried and is holding its breath. She had checked on him twice through the night from her bedroom doorway. Both times he was still. Both times she had gone back to bed and not slept. She heard the engines at 7:13. Not one engine. Not two. A low collective rumble that started somewhere at the end of her street and grew steadily, deliberately, like something enormous, moving in formation. She set her coffee down slowly and did not move. She went to the front window and looked through the gap in the curtain. The street outside, her quiet, ordinary residential street that she had lived on for 6 years without a single remarkable thing happening, was completely transformed. 20 black SUVs were parked in a long, perfect line, stretching from her driveway to the corner, not parked carelessly the way normal vehicles park. Parked with a precision that suggested the people who had done it many times before. Suited men stood at intervals along the street, utterly still in the cold morning light, their breath rising in small white clouds, their hands folded in front of them. Nobody was shouting, nobody was moving. They were simply there, waiting, patient, and in absolute total control of every inch of space outside her home. Emma let the curtain fall back and turned around. He was standing in the middle of her living room. Upright, fully dressed in the clean shirt and dark trousers his men had apparently left on her porch sometime before dawn without her hearing a sound, his color almost entirely restored, the dangerous gray watchfulness back in his eyes in full. The man from the floor, the bleeding unconscious stranger she had dragged over her threshold in the dark, was simply gone. The man standing in his place occupied the room differently, completely, like he had always been the most important thing in it and was only now allowing it to be acknowledged. He looked at her standing by the window and said, "Do not open the door until I tell you." His voice was not raised. It did not need to be. Emma looked at him for a long moment. Then she crossed her arms over her chest, a gesture she was aware looked defensive and did not particularly care, and said, "Who are you?" Not a question with a rising inflection, a flat demand. The kind she used with patients who were lying about how much they had taken or how long they had been bleeding. The kind that said, "I am not asking to make conversation. I am asking because I need the information right now." He looked at her across the small, warm space of her living room, with her blankets still piled on her rug and her soup bowl still on the floor, and he told her his name, Luca Ferretti. She did not recognize it immediately. It took 4 seconds, she counted, and then it landed. Not from the news, not from a headline. From a night 14 months ago when she had treated a young man in the ER with 3 gunshot wounds who had checked in under a false name, whose frightened friends had refused to give her any information, and one of whom had said, very quietly, to another, thinking she was not close enough to hear, "Ferretti is going to want to know about this." She had not known what it meant then. She understood now. She had been treating the edges of his world for years without knowing it. That realization moved through her slowly and settled somewhere unpleasant. She thought about the other patients, the ones who came in at odd hours with injuries that did not match the explanations they gave, the ones who paid in cash and left before the paperwork was finished, the ones whose frightened companions watched the door the entire time. She had treated them all with the same care she gave everyone. She had asked no questions she was not given answers to. And all of it, every single one of those late nights and careful silences, had somehow been orbiting this man standing in her living room without her ever knowing his name. She sat down on the arm of the sofa because standing suddenly required more effort than she had available. He told her the rest of it plainly, the way he seemed to do everything without softening it and without drama. Someone inside his own organization had arranged the ambush. A man he had trusted for 11 years, who had known his schedule, his route, and the precise window of time he would be alone. The shot had been clean and deliberate, and the man had driven away and left him in the snow, expecting the cold to finish what the bullet had started. The SUVs outside were his people loyalists, who had spent the night tracking his last known location and found the blood trail in her driveway at first light. He had called them from her living room at 4 in the morning while she lay awake upstairs listening. He told her all of this looking directly at her, and when he finished, he waited. She understood that he was giving her a moment to be angry before he moved past it. She appreciated that more than she wanted to. She was angry. She told him so. Not loudly. Emma did not do things loudly, but with the particular quiet precision of a woman who had spent her entire adult life saying difficult things to people who did not want to hear them. She told him he had brought a war to her front porch without her consent, and that the fact that she had chosen to drag him inside did not mean she had chosen any of what came after it. He listened to all of it without interrupting, which surprised her. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You saved my life. In my world, that creates a debt that does not expire. You are protected now. Every person outside that door would die before they let anything happen to you." She opened her mouth. He continued, "I know you did not ask for that. I know it does not feel like a gift. I am telling you anyway because you deserve to know what you are walking into." She closed her mouth. Outside, the engines idled in the cold morning silence. He walked to her front door and opened it, and stepped out onto the porch into the cold morning light, and every single one of those suited men standing in the snow turned their heads toward him at the same moment. And then, before Emma could process what was happening, he said something she could not hear. and every single one of those men looked past him. Directly at her, standing in the doorway in her scrubs with her arms crossed and her hair still messy from a night without sleep, and every single one of them nodded. Not to him, to her. A slow, deliberate acknowledgement that had nothing to do with politeness, and everything to do with something she did not yet have a word for. She did not understand what it meant, but the look on Luca's face when he turned back to check that she had seen it told her that she was going to. He was gone for 6 hours. The SUVs left with him, all 20 of them, pulling away from her street in the same quiet formation they had arrived in, leaving behind nothing but parallel tracks in the snow, and an absence so complete it made her small house feel suddenly, strangely hollow. Emma spent those 6 hours doing ordinary things, with the focused deliberateness of a woman trying to convince herself that ordinary was still available to her. She cleaned. She changed the rug, the bloodstained one was beyond saving, and she rolled it and put it by the back door without letting herself think too hard about what had soaked into it. She remade the sofa. She scrubbed the kitchen counter where the gun had been. She did 3 loads of laundry. And when there was nothing left to clean, she sat at the kitchen table and looked at her hands and understood, quietly and without drama, that no amount of cleaning was going to make this house feel the way it had felt 48 hours ago. Something had shifted. Not broken, shifted. The way a room looks different after you move one piece of furniture, everything is still there, but your eye keeps going to where the thing used to be. He came back alone. No convoy this time, no suited men, no low rumble of engines announcing his arrival. Just a single knock at her door at 2:15 in the afternoon, 3 beats, unhurried, and when she opened it, he was standing on her porch in the cold with his hands in his pockets looking, for the first time since she had found him bleeding in her driveway, like a man who was tired, not physically, the other kind, the kind that lives behind the eyes and does not go away with sleep. She stepped back and let him in without a word because it was cold, and because some decisions had already been made several hours ago at a kitchen table without her fully realizing she was making them. He told her it was over. The lieutenant who had arranged the ambush had been found and dealt with. He did not give her details, and she did not ask for them. The threat was gone. Her home was clean. Nobody was coming for her, and nobody would. She was free to go back to her life exactly as it had been before she turned into her driveway 2 nights ago. He said all of this standing in her kitchen in the afternoon light, steady and direct, giving her the information she needed the way he seemed to give everything completely, without softening it. She listened to all of it, and when he finished, she turned to the stove and put the kettle on, because it was something to do with her hands, and because she had absolutely no idea what to do with the feeling that was sitting in the center of her chest where relief was supposed to be but wasn't. They sat across from each other at her kitchen table with 2 mugs of tea. Neither of them was drinking, and she asked him the question that had been sitting at the back of her mind since 4 in the morning when she had lain awake listening to his voice through the floor. She did not ask about the ambush or the organization or the 20 SUVs or any of the large, dangerous machinery of his life. She asked, "Did it surprise you?" He looked at her. He understood immediately what she meant, not the logistics of the betrayal, not the tactical failure, but the human part of it. The part that had nothing to do with bullets and everything to do with a person he had trusted sitting across a table from him and choosing otherwise. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was not going to answer. Then, the ones who hurt you the most are always the ones you fed at your own table. He said it, looking at his mug. She looked at him, looking at his mug, and she understood that he was not talking only about the lieutenant. He stood up to leave. She walked him to the door the way you walk someone out when you are hoping they will say something before they get there and not quite admitting it to yourself. He stopped at the door. His hand rested on the frame for a moment, and he looked at her all the way, looked, the wall completely down, the watchfulness gone, just the man underneath it standing in her hallway in the afternoon light. She had seen this face once before, in the lamplight, just before his hand had come up around her wrist. She had thought then that it was the fever making him unguarded. She understood now that it was not the fever at all. "Come with me." 2 words, said quietly, with no performance around them. Not a command, and not a plea, just the simple, honest shape of what he wanted, laid down between them, like something he had been carrying and had finally decided to set on the table. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked around her kitchen, the clean counter, the 2 mugs, the morning light on the floor she had scrubbed. The careful, quiet life she had built here, room by room, year by year. She looked back at him, and she went upstairs. She came back down 4 minutes later with a bag on her shoulder. Not a large bag she had packed, the way she packed for long hospital shifts, practical and fast, only what actually mattered. She walked to where he was still standing in her hallway and stopped in front of him and put her hands on either side of his face, the same hands that had spent an hour stitching him back together in the dark, and kissed him properly. And completely for the first time. Not a temple kiss in the lamplight, not a question, just the full, certain weight of a decision already made. He wrapped both arms around her and held on with the particular careful tightness of a man who has not let himself hold anything in a very long time and is only now remembering how. When they finally stepped apart, she adjusted the bag on her shoulder and looked at him. "Well," she said, "are we going or not?" And Luca Ferretti, a man who had not smiled in longer than he could honestly remember, smiled. If Emma's story found you today, if you have ever made a decision that looked like the wrong one from the outside and turned out to be the truest thing you ever did, then this channel was made for you. We tell stories about ordinary women who turn out to be extraordinary, about the kind of courage that does not announce itself, about love that arrives at the worst possible moment and turns out to be exactly on time. Subscribe to Mafia Boss and Her. A new story is already waiting. And just like Emma, you will not regret walking through that door.